Thanks, Phil. I appreciate it, and I'd like to add my welcome to everybody on the webinar today. This is, gosh, we've done a variety of different webinars together. Steve and I have over the last couple of years, and it's always a pleasure to be on a webinar with Steve as well. So we're going to go ahead and get started in the presentation today. Phil, you can go ahead and advance the slides. So the speakers, Phil gave us a good background as well. Just a couple other comments. I'm a CPA by trade, but have the CIA and CISA designations. And my background includes both audit experience and auditor and auditee experience. I'm going to be doing a couple sections here in a little bit, but I'm going to turn the presentation over to Steve to do a portion of his, and then I'll be back towards the middle of our webinar.
Thanks, Jeff. This is Steve Coast, and I'm kind of doing the other part of the presentation. And this works really well because Jeff and I have very complementary backgrounds. Where Jeff is the auditor, I'm coming at the problem as being a DBA, applications DBA, and a security architect. So I've been doing a lot with the Oracle Business Suite, Oracle databases, and securing it for our customers. So this presentation kind of will jump around a little bit. We'll talk a little bit about the auditing side and also the IT security side. So kind of complement each other, and we'll talk about kind of what those areas that we have our best expertise in. So we'll kind of walk through a couple different threats. What we did is when we came up with this presentation, we kind of sat down together and said, for the Oracle Business Suite, what are some of the security threats that are hidden? That when we go to different clients and do assessments, Jeff and I work together, and we also do assessments on our own. What are the problems that we just see over and over and over? What are auditors missing? What's IT security missing? What are the DBAs missing in terms of kind of key risks in the Oracle Business Suite environment that need to be addressed but is just completely overlooked, and that really kind of blow the application controls out of the water? What can people do to get around those application controls and take over the entire environment, do fraud, steal data, things like that? And we really came up with 5 of those. We'll talk about the password decryption threat, user profile options, application diagnostics, sensitive admin page access, and finally finished up with a very technical one, database accounts, passwords. So we'll get started and kind of go through these, and kind of Jeff and I will take those topics that are in our respective areas. And we'll start with the application decryption threat. So the threat here is that basically the application stores the user's passwords, and it basically needs to have those passwords in the application so when you log in it can authenticate them. Fortunately, if you're running single sign-on, the applications actually won't be stored in the Business Suite. So there is one advantage of if you've implemented Oracle single sign-on using Oracle Identity Manager, hooking up with an LDAP server or Active Directory. If you have that environment, you can kind of close your eyes for a few minutes because you're not vulnerable to this threat. But if you're just using Oracle Business Suite Security, people can basically decrypt the passwords. And the way this works is we've got our little bad guy here. We'll call him Programmer Dude. Let's say you've got a disgruntled programmer. You ended his contract early, but he's still there for a week or two to transition. And he kind of wants to get back at it. He wants to make sure he gets his last invoice paid or something like that. And so what happens in a normal Oracle Business Suite environment is when you are cloning from production down to your test and development environments, in almost every Business Suite environment that happens on a routine basis. It may happen weekly to something like test, but every month or a couple months will happen to development. When you're doing that cloning, you're actually taking all the live passwords from the production environment and copying it down in test and development. So then what happens is you've got Programmer Dude who can go in, and usually the restrictions are somewhat relaxed in the development environment. The developers need a little bit of access. They need to be able to go in and query some of the tables. So you might have opened up the FND user table to some of the programmers so they can actually query it. Well, what you can do is actually query that table, FND user, and then actually decrypt the passwords. Well, those passwords are actually the live passwords in production, so all he has to do is now he's got all your application users' passwords. So he's got your AP super user, your AP manager, your AP clerk, your vendor management person. So he can actually go now into production and log in using all those different accounts and probably set up a vendor using one account, create some purchase orders using another, receive some invoices another, and actually make payments with another account. So a very classic pay fraud type situation. This is very doable because basically he's got the production passwords, and who would know? These are just standard users logging in, unless you're tracing back to maybe IP addresses to see that one IP address is using multiple logins or something like that. That's the only way you'll catch it until you realize that a malicious vendor has been set up and actually been paid. And it's actually not that hard to do. So when we actually look at the table, we'll get into a little nitty-gritty here. The FND user table actually stores both the user's passwords and the app's password encrypted. So this is kind of a dump of the FND user table. I just picked a couple of users, guest, sysadmin, wizard. And if we look at what's actually stored in the table, there's two columns, one called encrypted foundation password, the other called encrypted user password. In the encrypted foundation password is both the app's password, and it's encrypted using the username and user's password as the encryption key. In the encrypted user password, it's basically the user's password encrypted using the app's password. So if I can get the app's password in the development environment, I can unencrypt all those values and actually get every single user's password. Well, oh, that's got to be really hard, right? Because it couldn't be easy to decrypt all those passwords. Well, if you just Google Oracle Applications Password Decryption, there's 4 or 5 different websites who have very detailed SQL statements that tell you exactly, step by step, with full SQL on how to do this. And this is kind of the sample SQL statement. There's 1 or 2 things you have to do before this, but basically this is as complicated as the SQL statement is. You'd think, okay, that'd be hard to write, but I just copied this directly off of a website. So all the information is out there. So any developer or anyone who has access to a development environment for Oracle Business Suite can very easily decrypt all the users' passwords. This is not rocket science. As long as somebody has access to the FND user table, either production or development, they can basically get everyone's passwords pretty quickly and easily. So basically the problem here is Oracle's encrypting the passwords. They're not hashing them. Hashing is when you're basically taking the password and making it not reversible. Encryption is I've got a key. I can actually get back to the original value. And Oracle's actually come up with a way to hash the passwords. And the biggest problem here is you're basically cloning from test, from production to test and development. So how do you solve this problem? Well, Oracle has actually enabled password hashing. So they've come up with a way, and it was actually back in 2007 that they actually released this. It's a patch. It's available for 11i, and it's actually included by default with R12. But typically, Oracle doesn't enable optional features by default. So if you've installed the latest and greatest 12.1 and you're running it, well, unless your DBAs have actually gone in and manually migrated all the passwords from being encrypted to hashing, you're still encrypting the passwords and not hashing them. So the DBAs have to go in and do this. So even if you've upgraded to R12, you recently installed R12, unless the DBAs have done this manual step, you don't have it as secure as you can. So basically, you have to make sure that your DBAs have gone in and run FND CPass user migrate. There's my Oracle support note. I've included the numbers here. The second thing you have to do is actually change all the application users' passwords when you're cloning from production, test, and development. Because the problem is anyone can go in. Even if you're hashing them, it's possible to brute force them. So I can actually try all combinations and try to get back to an original password if I can get into the hashes. And so that's typically still possible in test and development. Even if I've made them more secure, they aren't fully secure. So whenever you do a clone, you have to be making sure the DBAs, as part of their cloning, are basically changing all the end user passwords. And you should actually be changing almost all credentials. You should be changing all the database passwords, OS level passwords, and application user passwords. The one problem that everyone says is, well, then how does everyone log into test and development because I've now changed all the passwords? The easiest way around that is actually just enable the forgot password functionality. So they can actually then go in and request the password and have it reset for them. That tends to be the most secure. It does provide one more step, but it actually works fairly effectively because typically you don't change the email addresses either. So that's kind of a brief background about the password encryption threat. We are going to have another series of webinars coming up. We have one in April and one in May. And the one in April will be talking about the password decryption threat in great detail. We're actually going to take the whole hour and go through it and actually show you an example, run the SQL and things like that. So I'll turn it back to Jeff and we'll talk about user profile options.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate it. So the next two topics we're going to cover are a couple of the higher area of risks in the application security side. So I'm dealing more with the application security side versus the IT security or the tech stack that Steve deals with. The first topic is kind of an excerpt from the webinar I did in January, a smaller portion of that. There's a full, more longer version of this available on our website. But it is definitely one of the more common security risks that we find that kind of bleeds over into the controls area. So just as a bit of a background on this, profile options control a variety of configurations, module configurations specific to certain functionality, as well as security-related issues. So there's two ways that profile options get set. The first one you can see in this screenshot is the system profile values form. Typically, this is accessed through the system administrator responsibility, and the changes in the production environment are typically made through security administrators through the system administrator responsibility. So this is the first way. You can go on the next slide, Phil. The second way is through the user profile values form. And this is a form that is, frankly, all over the place within the application. It's in a lot of the requests, or the request submit or the request submenus in a variety of different modules. So it's commonly identified or commonly accessible by a wide variety of users, which is why we deem this to be a significant security threat. So this is the personal profile values form, often referred to as user profile values as well. So you can go on to the next slide here.
And you should have control, Jeff.
I do have control. Okay, thanks. So the major risk related to user profile values is the override of controls via the user profile values form. As we're going to see, there's in the next slide, there's a variety of different levels where profile options can be set and the values related to those. And if you have system-wide configurations, or if you have something set at the responsibility or application level, if the user overrides that or sets a profile option at the user level, it overrides the other level. So it overrides the site responsibility or application level profile options. So the most significant risk is areas where, like I said, the user can override it through the user profile values form, and that changes the system profile values or overrides it. So we're going to look at that, a specific example here in a second. The second thing would be kind of taking the hat off of user profile values, but more generically, the system profile values form is where profile options are set at any level that are not analyzed or properly approved by appropriate personnel. So often changes are being required to be made or asked to be made by the security administrator, and the security administrator will have a certain protocol or a certain governance process for making sure those profile options are approved. And sometimes they will get an approval from a process owner or a module owner that will be looking for certain operational objectives. So they want operational efficiency and data entry or something along those lines. But that may or may not be the right thing to do as it relates to overall control objectives, or you could have the opposite true. So the third here is, and this here just saying system profile options are not met to meet control objectives or operational objectives. So to give you some context of this, this is a screenshot from an R12 environment. And what I'm showing here is there's 8,907 different profile options in this environment. This is the profile. This is where profiles are set up, or when they're entered by Oracle, or not entered, but the applications are installed by Oracle. This is the form you would go to see how they're set, or if you're setting up new profile options, like custom profile options, where you go in to set them. So the question is, from an auditor's perspective, is how many of these 8,900 profile options, if you look at that number, how many of these can be updated by an end user through the user profile values form, and of those that are updatable by an end user, which ones have significant risk associated with it. So we're going to go on to the next slide here and look at a very specific example. that has an internal controls risk. So this is the user profile option named GL Journal Review Required. If you're using the journal approval workflow configuration, this determines whether or not journals that are produced from the auto allocation or the allocation process go through the journal approval workflow. So if the profile is set to no, it does not go through the journal approval workflow. If it's set to yes, then those that are generated from the auto allocation process are configured. Now, I'm not going to get into the details of that. There's pros and cons to having this configured, depending upon how you have your access point or your control points related to the auto allocation process set up. But on the right-hand side here, you see this user access, and where it shows as updatable on the lower right-hand, I've got it highlighted in red. That means it can be maintained through the personal profile values or the user profile values form. On the left-hand side, you see this hierarchy type access level box. That would indicate where it can be maintained through the system, the overall profile values or the system profile values form that's typically done through the application administrator or security administrator. So you can see that the security administrator can maintain it through the system profile values form, but as it relates to this particular risk, it also can be maintained by the user through the personal profile values form. So this is accessing the personal profile values form through, it happens to be the application developer responsibility, but this is probably going to be accessible through a wide variety of end user responsibilities or custom responsibilities in your environment. And this is where I just queried up the GL Journal Review Required, and on the right-hand side, I just clicked on the list of values and it shows me the list of values. So just to recap on this risk, then, if you had it set at no or yes at the user level, or this, I'm sorry, yeah, it's set to yes at the site level, they could enter this at no at the user level, and that would override the site level configuration, so they could update it for themselves, and essentially causing a hole or a gap in the control design and operating effectiveness within this environment. So point being here, as we get to the next slide, what are the control expectations related to this? Specifically to the user profile values form, we typically recommend that this form is totally removed from all the end users. It's usually our going in point, so to speak. That is primarily because there hasn't been a risk assessment done to analyze, as we're going to talk about in the next slide, kind of which one should go through, should be maintained by an end user and which one should not. So if you've gone through some type of risk assessment, then you can do a personalization on this form to restrict access to just those profile options that are low risk. So things like Java color, number of copies for a printer, things that are either maintainable and are low enough risk that if they make a change, it's not impacting any operating controls or financial controls. So that's what we recommend for user profile values: either remove it altogether or personalize it just to a few elements that you feel comfortable them maintaining. On an overall basis for profile options, I talked about this risk assessment. So what you really should be doing is performing an overall risk assessment to determine which profile options should be subject to change management and who the approvers are related to those, because you could have this GL journal review process. You could have a need to have a process owner, like a module lead, like the controller, review any change to those profile options, but you may also want somebody independent of the controller in a corporate governance or an internal audit capacity review that change to make sure that that doesn't violate your control requirements or your control definition. So that's the first step. The second step of this is change management documentation, clearly identifying the profile options that are subject to the change management process, talking about who that's appropriate to make those approvals. And then, or it could be that all changes go through the change management process, whereby then you would not allow end users to make any changes, even through a form that was personalized. So the third element of this, from a controls perspective, if you want a log-based or a trigger-based auditing solution in place, As it stands, when changes are being made to those profile options, there is no detailed before and after value. There is no audit trail of inserts, updates, and deletes, what we call a DML audit trail, to gather the necessary system-based audit trail that's necessary to do quality assurance. So you need to implement a specific technology, and then the next two elements are you have a quality assurance process in place, and then you're actually testing that process. Either you're having management test it, and internal audit would be reviewing management's testing, or you're having somebody independent. You could have internal audit coming in and testing that on a regular basis. So that's kind of a snapshot of a summary of a full hour webinar I did a couple months back. Hopefully give you enough to think about as it relates to user profile values. Another topic I'm going to talk about here is application diagnostics. This is kind of a back-end access to the database through what we call professional forms. These are the professional forms here, as opposed to the HTML or OA framework forms. There are hundreds of these forms. I think probably the thousands of forms that are deployed throughout the application. Oracle's certainly moving away. Their new technology is moving away from forms to doing a more OA framework or HTML development. But there's a lot of these still out there and being used in a wide variety of fashion. So the backdoor access we call of application diagnostics is enabled through the utilities diagnostics profile option. And when it is enabled, you see this help diagnostics examine functionality. Typically this gets set at no at the site level. What we see sometimes is this gets enabled as yes at a user level for certain users. And we're going to look next on what this actually does. So the big risks are is backdoor access to maintain data that's not visible through forms or the corruption of data. Those are the two biggest risks. The example we have here is I just went into the appeal locations form, and this is the place that identifies where, for example, in the purchasing area, where shipments can be sent to. So that's the ship to locations for purchase orders. And you can see in that when this is accessed here, this examine fields and variable values form pops up, and then you can access here this choose a field box. I'm just trying to highlight this. It shows everything, which is everything that can be changed through this form, which is in essence everything on the underlying table. If your form is accessing multiple tables, you have a header, you've got an underscore TL or a translation table, you've got a detail table, then depending upon where you put your cursor within that form, you're going to be accessing different tables. So this is a place where I've shown where it's accessing the detail table underneath this, where the address information is available, and I'm just highlighting here where you can see some things like business group ID, the created by values, designated receiver ID. There are some fields on here that clearly are not meant to be maintained through the form, things like IDs or attributes that aren't deployed, and that in and of itself could corrupt the data. Now, the one good thing that happens, as we're going to see in my example here, is where I'm making a change, it still records it updates the created by and last updated by information. So this is a case where I've got a location field. The original value is 1234 Happy Lane. I just made an example. And this is originally created on March 13th, so I was doing this a couple days ago when we were preparing for this webinar. And when I make a change to this, so I'm making a change in the address through the back end, so to speak, or through this examine functionality, the value shows as fraudulent address. What it does when that change is saved to the database is it does update the updated by information. So there's a little bit of an audit trail created on this. It doesn't necessarily mean it can't update the updated by information through this, but the bigger area of monitoring for this, or the best way to monitor this, is if I go back to my profile options example, is to put some underlying trigger-based or log-based auditing functionality in place, so that even if they're accessing it through this, the trigger at the database level will create the before and after values through that mechanism and capture that information. And we typically deploy that type of technology on these higher risk areas like PO locations and supplier addresses and bank accounts and a wide variety of other things. So that's the best kind of underlying technology to be able to capture those things. So the recommendations for here is we do not recommend allowing access to the prod for anyone other than those perhaps like a DBA that already has access to the app's password, because in essence you're giving somebody full access as if they have the app's password through that form. So you could argue that if a DBA already has access to that and they're an apps DBA, that giving them access to this adds no more risk to your environment. But what we often see is business analysts or developers that have access to this in a production environment that don't have access or permission to make any changes through the app's password. So more often than not, a DBA shouldn't be in this environment, in the apps environment anyway. And they can run ad hoc SQL queries and do whatever they want through the apps login anyways. So we typically don't see this even deployed, or we don't like to see this deployed to anybody in a production environment. So the site level configuration for this utility diagnostics is set to no. So that's kind of it at a high level for application diagnostics. Would welcome any questions that you guys have. We get to the Q&A section, and I'm going to turn this the presentation back over to Steve for his last 2 points.
Thanks, Jeff. Very good information. So now we're going to kind of take the application and go a little bit one step farther. So Jeff talked about profile options and diagnostic pages. There's a lot of other sensitive administration pages within the Oracle E-Business Suite. And the problem is these administration pages are not just to create users and things like that. They're to help customize the application, provide significant more functionality. So a lot of these different pages let you input SQL statements, fragments of SQL statements, HTML, and some of them actually let you do operating system commands. So this large set of administration pages are scattered all throughout the application. And so Oracle has actually included since 2004 in the Best Practices for Securing the Oracle E-Business Suite guide a list of these pages. And recently they've actually moved it over into its own My Oracle support note. So I've got the support note number here. So anyone who doesn't have access to Oracle's My Support site should actually talk to the DBA and get a copy of this document. So the key problem here is that there's these pages and forms scattered throughout the application. Some are actually in forms, some are in pages, some are in personalizations and other places. And so what can happen is you can actually go in and enter a SQL statement. And for those of you not familiar with the way Oracle E-Business Suite works behind the scenes, is all the SQL statements are executed as one single database account, apps, which owns all the data, runs all the data, and does everything. So you can actually do anything you want in the database. If you're allowed to enter a SQL statement, there's a very good probability that you can actually do anything you want in the database. And so basically the threat is that I've got these non-privileged users, and through my segregation duties process, I've kind of missed these pages, and they've kind of snuck into somebody who probably shouldn't be a truly privileged user and now has access to something. And I'll pick on the Oracle alerts here. Most people have kind of figured out the Oracle alerts one, and so it's really not that major of an issue in most segregation of duties analyses, but it's really a lot of the other pages that we see problems with. But the Oracle alerts are a very good example because it's a very clear SQL statement. It's very easy to execute. And so what happens is we've got programmer dude back, and so for some reason he's been given access because he's really the only guy who knows how to write SQL statements, so he's been given access to production to actually go update the Oracle alerts. And so what he can do is, well, he doesn't think he's getting paid enough, so he can actually go execute a SQL statement to update his salary. In this example, he actually wants to go and just get the sysadmin password. So in an Oracle alert, which basically is just a SQL statement that runs and then executes some action, he can actually put in that SQL statement, part of it, to just change the sysadmin password. And so what he'll do is just execute that. The next time the alert runs, he'll actually change the sysadmin password, and then he can log in as a sysadmin account and do just about anything he wants. So that's kind of a very simple example of it. It can be a lot more complicated, but there's basically the same steps as you enter a SQL statement. For some reason, that SQL statement executes, and then you take advantage of what that SQL statement did. So the problem is not that it's very easy to find where these SQL forms are. They're scattered throughout the application, both in forms, in web pages, Just about every module has maybe one or two forms that let you enter parts of SQL statements. So this is actually a partial listing that's actually from the Oracle document. One of the fun things that Jeff does all the time is probably on a weekly or every couple of weeks, he'll actually send me a new form that he's found that actually accepts a SQL statement. So even though Oracle has a list, there's probably dozens more that everybody has missed about what pages can actually enter SQL statements. So this is a partial listing. So that's the problem, is when you start to look at your segregation duties, you're saying, okay, this person doesn't really have any privileges, they can't do much. Oh, by the way, they might have access to defined WMS rules, which therefore would allow them to enter a SQL statement, which can be executed as apps, which therefore they have full control over the application. They can do anything they want. So this becomes a very tricky problem. And what we're going to do is actually in May have a complete webinar about sensitive administration pages, and we'll actually walk through many more examples and talk about how to find them, what the true risk is, and what you can do about it. So the first part is the sensitive forms and pages are often not in the SOD matrices. So people have a well-defined out, they think they're doing a great job, but when we start to actually look at these forms and pages at the function level, well, they're being missed. They're actually included as non-privileged forms and pages when they actually should be privileged. Then the second part is the listings from Oracle aren't correct. They aren't complete. They don't have every single form or page that need to be included. So even though you say, okay, yeah, no, we went through every one we've included, well, there's a good possibility that there's some out there that you don't know about. And we're trying to do different ways to search for them, and they just keep popping up. It's kind of interesting. And then the final problem is to really figure out who has access to these. This is down to a function level. Oracle provides a SQL script. There's a number out on the internet. If you Google for them, you can find out and get a complete listing of different functions, but you have to know the function, and this becomes very tiresome and tedious to go through and say, okay, I've got a function, who's got access to it, what responsibilities have access to it. It becomes a nightmare to try to figure out exactly who has access to these and go, especially when there's 50 or 60 of these functions, that you have to go through and figure out who's got access, should they have access, how does that fit into our segregation duties. So it's a pretty complicated problem to try to solve. And we'll do an entire webinar kind of going through that and kind of what's the best way to do it and the best way to solve this problem. So that's kind of sensitive administration pages. Now we're going to kind of transition from more application level into at the database level. So database security can also undermine your application security controls. And fundamentally, if you have default or weak passwords at the database level, basically now you're potentially allowing anybody in who can basically take over the entire database. And the problem with the Oracle E-Business Suite environment is really almost every database account defined within the application has full access to the database. Every account has at least a few privileges that can do pretty significant things. That's just the way the architecture works for Oracle E-Business Suite. Or if you haven't applied Oracle Critical Patch updates, there's a potential that they can actually execute those vulnerabilities because there's security vulnerabilities patched each quarter. And if you haven't applied the latest security patch update, you actually have open security vulnerabilities. And so someone can log in with any account, typically, even at the ones with the lowest privileges, and actually potentially take over the entire database. There's a couple of different scenarios that work here. One is you can just probably find a default password and log into production quickly. But the other scenario is actually, again, just like the application passwords, when you're doing database clones from production to test and development, you're actually cloning the passwords again. And unless DBAs after the clone are changing every single password, they're in your test and development with the same password as production. And I'll show you in a few minutes why that's kind of pretty critical and why when you clone them it's actually a worse case scenario than the application sometimes. Well, all the programmer has to do is go into the test and development environment, read the hashes from user dollar. Fortunately, compared to the application passwords, these are hashes. They aren't encrypted. So you actually have to brute force them. And what brute forcing is basically I'm just guessing. I'm trying every possible combination of the password until I can actually match a password. But it is very easy and very possible to actually just take the passwords home and actually put them on your home machine and just have the algorithm run over and over and over. And it tries millions and millions of combinations. And I'll actually show you our tool in a minute here. and you can actually run it for a weekend. There's one case where someone was arrested and they actually ran their password cracker for over a month on one single account, finally got it. It took them a month to do it of constant running, and then they were actually able to log into a production system and actually steal some data. But this is basically the way it works, is so he'll basically brute force and crack the password. And if you want to look for Oracle password crackers, just go into Google and type in Oracle password cracker, and it'll actually pop up dozens and dozens of different crackers, so they're pretty easy to obtain. And then you can just use that database account to log into production. So the reason this becomes a more significant problem is that Oracle passwords aren't that well protected. They've actually recently changed the hashing algorithm in 11G. It used to be a pretty old cryptography. So it used to be a DES hash. And so DES is an encryption algorithm, and they were actually using it to turn into a hash. Well, in Oracle 11G, they have actually changed the password storage to basically using a Defense Department approved standard of SHA-1, which is actually now becoming even outdated as we speak. The problem is when they're hashing the password is when they hash it. So if you take a user system in the password manager and you hash it, it comes up with a hash, and that hash is the same for every database in the world. So there is no salting per database. And salting would be I'd add some unique information to change it for each time I hash it. Well, in this case, if you go into any database in the world and you look at the hash and it's D4D blah, 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 37, you know for the system account that password is manager. So it's very easy to guess and actually build tables of very common passwords and very quickly look for them. Well, for the e-business suite, you add in a couple more problems. So, well, the hashes for the database passwords are easily crackable. Well, now for the e-business suite, we actually add in a couple more issues. One is there's lots and lots of different database accounts. So when you install Oracle e-business suite, you get over 300 database accounts because there's one database account for each module. So if you have General Ledger, even if you aren't using General Ledger, it's always installed. So every module is installed by default. So you have Oracle Student System running, manufacturing, CRM, even if you're just running financials. So for General Ledger, there's an account called General Ledger for AP, AR, Fixed Assets, FA. So there's all these different accounts, and each one comes with the default password. So I know your GL account default password is GL, so unless the DBAs have changed it, it's always there. Also, all these 300 accounts all have significant privileges. Every single one of those accounts can actually take over the entire database. They have access to a couple packages that allow them to execute significant SQL statements. Then finally is these accounts are being added all the time. So every single time you do an upgrade where there's a new module, you actually get a bunch of new database accounts. And unless the DBAs are sitting there watching for these new database accounts, they pop in, and guess what? They have default passwords. So usually the first thing we always look for is if you're just upgraded to release 12.1, we always start looking for the CA account. We know the password's CA, and unless the DBAs were very diligent about changing the passwords that were undocumented added, so when they ran the upgrade, there was no documentation to say, oh, by the way, we added a new database account because there's a new module for CA, go change that. There's no documentation to that. So unless the DBAs know about it and are looking for it, they would never find it. So if you did your upgrade to 12.1, most likely someone can go in and just connect to your database and go in the account CA and use the password CA, and they're in. And that account has enough privileges to do just about anything they want. So this becomes a big problem. So one of the things that we do at Integrigy is we do a lot of on-site security assessments, and one of the things we do is anonymize the data from each assessment, but basically aggregate it to see where are problems, where are we seeing the different problems. And so this is from about 120 different production databases that we've sampled over the last couple of years. And this has a lot of e-business suite, but this is also SAP environments, data warehouses, just about everyone. And we only took the standard database accounts. But this shows you, the third column shows you how often do we find that database account. Then the last column shows you how often it has a default password. So there's a sys and system account. Those are kind of the root accounts for the database. Well, almost every DBA changes those. Very seldom do we ever find a problem. But the problem is that there's all these other accounts like DBMSMP, CTX Sys. Well, in an Oracle e-business suite environment in 11i, the CTX Sys account has near DBA privileges. Well, 32% of the time we do assessments, we find that has the default password to CTXSys, and we can basically just log into the database and almost be DBA at that point. And so this is real life. These are basically problems that we are finding every single day in assessments. And when you find DBMSMP in 50% of the databases, that's a significant number. And one of the problems is it's not easy to find these. It's not like a standard feature that squawks at you when you do something to actually tell you that there's a default password. Oracle's getting better at it, but it's not perfect. So even if you have a default password, that's the worst case scenario. So the second worst case scenario is you have a weak password of some sort. So the Oracle passwords are hashed. So basically I can't decrypt them, there's no encryption password, but I can guess very quickly. And because the algorithms they're using allow me to guess them very quickly, I can do it at least for 1 million times a second. So I can do 1 million combinations every single second, and if I have specialized hardware, and in this case specialized hardware is basically the graphics board that your son just paid $100 for so he can play the latest games, that $100 board can do 100 million passwords per second. So even if you have your passwords as 9 characters, running full time using a graphics card and off-the-shelf software, if you just Google password cracker, a number of the standard password crackers can use graphics boards from companies like NVIDIA, I can crack your password in 16 days, even if it's length of 9. So it's very important to be changing these passwords in development after you're doing clones, and then also have very strong database password standards if someone can get in there and get the hashes. So the big issue is it becomes, how do you check the passwords? Well, Oracle has actually recently come out with a utility called DBA Users with Depth Password View, and this allows you to basically check a few different combinations of passwords. It's not too bad, but it's not great at all. It'll just check a limited set of accounts. There's about 700 accounts by default, and it actually checks about a single password for each account. So it's better than nothing. You should be definitely having the DBAs check it, or if you're doing a security assessment, you should be asking the DBAs to run it and give you the output. The best case scenario is actually using a third-party tool. So there are a number of command line tools out there, or a BF is one of the better ones because it's Oracle brute force. And those are command line tools, so they're not easy to use, but they are very effective. They can actually run through all the different combinations. And you can get it up to a couple of million combinations per second with those type of tools. Integrigy, we have a tool called App Sentry, which performs a lot of different security checks, but one of the things that we do is a very in-depth password checking. So we check application passwords, we check database passwords, and we're actually providing password lists and password dictionaries of 1 million passwords. So we're checking many, many different combinations of passwords. And what I'll do here is quickly show you. A lot of people say, well, how hard is this? This can't be that hard, right? Well, what I've done, this is our tool at Integrigy that we use to basically check passwords in the database. So what I've done is just queried for the Oracle Business Suite Vision instance. And so I've just kind of loaded that up in our tool, and I'll check passwords. And in this environment, it's pretty good. It's actually supposed to be finding a couple here. So of course, whenever you run a live demo, you always run into a problem. So we'll try that again. It's supposed to be finding many passwords in this one. There we go. So as you can see, it actually went through and found within a couple seconds all the default passwords. So that's how easy it is to define a default password. In this case, we did check a number of combinations. This Vision instance had a lot. In this case, AV Monitor has actually a pretty strong password. And in this case, we checked actually 183,000, and we were actually able to check that in a couple seconds. So it's very easy and very quickly to, you can check hundreds and hundreds of passwords, up to a couple million a second, using just off-the-shelf tools. So anyone who says, oh, no one could ever try to brute force those and figure it out, well, there's just like this utility, there's dozens and dozens on the internet that allow you to actually go through and try to crack passwords very quickly. So you should be checking the passwords on a periodic basis, because you're basically, someone can go in and do direct SQL and bypass all your application security controls. So that's kind of a few of the hidden security dangers. I'll kind of pass it back to Jeff here and talk about some conclusions.
Excellent. Thanks, Steve. I appreciate it. So I think the big two conclusions I wanted to just pass by everybody today and make sure they are clearly understood is that, first and foremost, that security is complicated. It's certainly not a one-time event. It's changing constantly as your environment is changing. There are large changes like patches that get applied, upgrades that happen. There are small changes like development activities that get moved to a production environment that change things like profile options, or maybe add, in some cases, could be adding some new default database logins or something like that for those products or something that's being moved in. Each environment is unique, depending upon what applications are being used, what third-party applications are being used, those type of things. So this topic hopefully will give you some basis for understanding the complexity. And then the second part of this is that the Oracle security documents alone cannot be relied upon as complete. So even if you are using some of the out-of-the-box stuff that Steve talked about, the documentation they provide isn't complete. It's ever changing, and we on both sides, the Integrigy and the ERP Risk Advisor side, continue to identify new vulnerabilities. And in some cases, those vulnerabilities take years for Oracle to get into their documentation. So we obviously are a little biased in this, but we recommend that you use a third-party company like either Integrigy or ERP Risk Advisors, or a combination of us, to be able to do some of your vulnerability assessments and security analysis. So this is the start of a webinar series we have that ERP Risk Advisors and Integrigy are doing on a couple topics, and we're going to dive into a couple of these topics we talked about today at a high level in a little bit more detail over the next couple months. So there are 2 dates here. Those are available on both our websites to click through, and the copies of these slides will be available as well for you guys to click through these links and to get the information. So from a resources perspective, there's a variety of resources we talked about today. Our website, the Integrigy website, there's a couple of list servers that we host and have hosted for a long time. The Oracle SOX list server has been around for probably 8 or 9 years now. Kind of a free-form server that anybody can use to post questions to the group. There's quite a few people on that, I think 1,500 people. And the internal controls repository is something we have for end users only. So as we identify, for example, new SQL forms, we do post something to that group. And if you are a security administrator or somebody that is interested internally at seeing some new things that we uncover, we do post things to that group for you to update some scripts or your audit procedures. And then there's my book out there as well that Phil mentioned earlier. It's available on Amazon. And then there's a couple of notes here, some that are particularly important for Oracle security notes. So those are just a couple of examples. And then I mentioned the profile options webinar that we did a couple months ago. That is available along with about a dozen other recorded webinars we've done over the last couple of years. Building an audit trail is one of those that, if you want to dive into that lack of audit trail information in a little more detail, that's available on there. And then we do a free what we call a 10,000-foot assessment that looks at the entire application. It entirely looks at the application security side. It's not focusing on the database or OS type of IT security elements that Integrigy does. But there's information on that on our website if you want a high-level assessment focusing on some of our application security best practices. And finally, our contact information is available, and we will leave this contact information up as we head into the Q&A section, which I think at this point we're going to turn back over to Phil and see what questions came up.
Thank you, Jeff. We have several questions here. The first one: how is Oracle Corporation going to address these threats in the future?
Why don't we both take that, Steve? I'll take that to start, and maybe you can kind of look at it from your perspective. I would say that Oracle, if you go back a couple of years, as it relates to some scripts, those type of things, whether it's access to SQL forms or the database cracking scripts, there was very little out there. So Oracle, in fairness, has provided some information publicly available to do some of the analysis on these. Number one, we've already talked about is it's not complete. from a data perspective, and there's certainly things that they're not looking at within the context of those that are equally as important as the things that they are looking at. Our kind of criticism overall of Oracle is they should be having a process in place as part of their development. Every time they're making a new patch release, just like you would expect them to be able to update the information and have a full, thorough analysis on this. So the fact that they've only recently come out with some of these scripts, the scripts aren't complete. In some cases, there's many more scripts that we have, things we look at or Integrigy looks at that it should be looked at. It really begs the question why Oracle hasn't done a better job of managing their own environment and publishing a more comprehensive process, if you will, or set of procedures to be able to analyze some of these risks. So I don't, frankly, have a whole lot of confidence that they'll ever get to that point. They just, it appears to me, haven't made it a priority internally to fully address these risks and help their customers. And there's a lot of examples I could talk about that that are known, either process design risks or vulnerabilities that have existed, for as long as I've been in this space, which is coming on 14, 15 years now. So those are some of my comments. Steve, you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I see kind of two areas that Oracle hasn't done. I think they made slow and steady progress on a number of areas, but one is if customers aren't complaining about it, Oracle's not fixing it. There's a number of areas that people have complained about and Oracle has fixed. One was credit card encryption, where they had a lot of customer feedback. They had to do it for PCI compliance. It was a massive, massive change, and they made it. There's a lot of other areas that the auditors are concerned about, not the direct Oracle customer within the organization. And so auditors may be kind of jumping up and down on it, complaining about it, but it's not really feeding back into Oracle. So they're not seeing and hearing a lot of the problems on, like, how do you best audit this massive application? And so those things aren't getting done because Oracle just doesn't have visibility. They don't have pressure from customers to fix. And two, it's a lot of the issues that we see from the kind of the under the technology layer is a lot of it's a quality control issue within Oracle. So every time Oracle comes out with the critical patch update every quarter, those are security bugs. They're security vulnerabilities, but primarily they're bugs. Someone made a mistake in the coding and allowed a vulnerability to be introduced into the code. And so that's purely a code quality issue. So Oracle, a lot of people say, oh yeah, they have a great security history. They have a great security feature history, but they don't have a great security quality control. So they have a lot of great security features, but in terms of actually people writing code and mistake-free code is really where the problem is. That's why you'll see critical patch updates and security bugs coming out for the foreseeable future. I don't see in the next 3 or 4 years that being fixed. And a lot of these changes take a lot of time and effort, and the effort is frankly on Fusion. Yeah, they're putting development resources in e-business suite, but if you've got a limited set of development budget and Fusion's out there and e-business suite, where are you going to put the most of your time and effort in?
Yeah, you make some good points, Steve. I just want to add one point to that. I think as it relates to feedback from the customers on certain issues, I mean, the highest risk areas, they've addressed those areas because they've gotten feedback from a wide variety of customers. But there are, dozens, or in some cases 100 or plus more, what would some people may say lower risk areas, some that can be solved via technology solutions like we talked about, like a trigger-based auditing solution. But I think that the inherent flaw that I see is lack of a customer advisory board or a SIG group that looks at GRC in general or security vulnerabilities in general, and that the mechanism just isn't there for the average chief security officer or even internal auditors. They're relying way too much on external auditors, which in a lot of cases don't have the level of skills that are necessary to give them feedback. So I mean, gosh, I'm trying to think about in 2008 or something like that, I sent letters to about everybody I could think of in Oracle that said, hey, you guys need to, your customer advisory boards, your SIG process or something is broke because you're not getting the feedback mechanism. And I haven't seen that addressed even, going forward with anything Fusion or else. So I think we've hit that topic now. Phil, do you got a next topic?
Yes, we've got about half a dozen questions here. So, next question is, what are examples of null prompted system functions?
That's a good question. I get that question a lot on the application side. So null prompts are, if you look at the way menus are developed, there are a submenu or a function that doesn't have an associated prompt related to it. And often an auditor will say, or somebody that maybe is a little bit naive about security architecture will say that if it doesn't have a prompt, it can't be accessed. And that's not really true. Sometimes the way that Oracle develops a form, and I'll take an old form, which is the journal entry form, it's been around forever. They have, within the context of that form, a post journals button. And so, for example, if you're trying to break apart inner journals versus post journals, so somebody can enter journals but they can't post the journals, if you don't know that there's a sub-function on the inner journals form, which some people would call a null prompt because there's not a prompt associated with it. You can't click on a button and go directly to that post journals form. It is a sub-function within the inner journals form. If you don't know that that's a vulnerability or doesn't exist, then you wouldn't be able to fully identify that SOD risk, segregation duties risk between inner journals and post journals. So there are a lot of examples I could give. That's probably the best one I can come up with. But needless to say, when we, as we've developed our SOD conflict matrix or sensitive function matrix that is being used by companies like Chaosys, as an example, in their CS compliance software, we have taken those things into consideration, those that are at the higher risk areas of what you would call a null prompt in the development of SOD or access controls. But yeah, they are definitely a risk and need to be considered. Not all of them. There's a small portion of them, but that small portion could be enough to cause you issues.
All right. Next one. Do you need an app's password to access the exam function?
You can set it that way, or you can set it not to do that. So I didn't show that fully, but the way the profile options can be set could be to either require the app's password or not require the app's password. To me, it doesn't really make a difference as it relates to the controls. If you're giving, if as we showed today, you're giving them access to the database, or you're requiring the app's password, only a limited number of people have access to that. So that in between, either it's available, not available, available with the app's password, or available 100%, the impact of that configuration isn't really relevant, because if somebody has access to the app's password, then they can do whatever they want through the direct database login anyways.
Next one. Can these risk areas, like database changes, be locked, like maybe not writable?
There's really no way for people to go in. If they can execute a SQL statement and it gets executed as apps, there's really no way to block it in any meaningful way. And that becomes a significant problem. So there's no easy way to do this. There's no easy way to audit it. You can try to put audit trails on a lot of this, but the problem is, fundamentally, for Oracle Business Suite, everything runs as the apps account. All the code is owned by apps, and everything gets executed as apps. All the reads, writes, inserts are all done as apps. So it's very difficult to kind of block it or even audit it, because everything's happening. So you have to somehow figure out some strategy to bucket it and say, okay, yeah, these are the types of connections that we're worried about. We don't care about the application server. We just care about when DBAs are connecting. Well, then how do we figure out who the DBAs are back to their names, because they're all connecting as the apps account. So it's not an easy thing to do in the Oracle Business Suite to audit at the technology layer, especially at the database.
Okay. Well, before I get to the next question, I might mention that the presentation, slides, and video will be made available either later today or early tomorrow to all of the attendees. Next question. Can you give some examples of where Oracle's information is incomplete?
I'll take that on my side. I think we both have examples, but real quickly, SQL Forms is a perfect example, and the script provided on the Metalink note that Steve mentioned earlier, where it breaks out those SQL Forms. There are, I think, 4 or 5 forms that we've identified that are available through the internal controls repository that are not on their list. So that would be one example.
An example from the database side. So I talked about how to check Oracle's got the default password view. Here, this view here, basically DBA users with default password to check about 700 different default passwords. Oh, by the way, when you upgrade to Oracle E-Business Suite, the accounts all down here are not included in that list. So you might be relying on that to basically check for default passwords, but you just recently did an Oracle 12.1 upgrade, and by the way, none of these new accounts will be actually on that list. So that kind of gives you just a very classic hole that, yeah, I have a big hole, it's going to happen, and my one tool to check it, because Oracle provided the tool, isn't checking for it.
Okay, last but not least, what sort of things are covered in the ERP Risk Advisor's free assessment?
Good question. So we do a very high-level scan of some basic SQL queries that we're running and looking at overall application security from a 10,000-foot level. It's not looking at SOD. It's not really looking at sensitive function access like you do through a SaaS offering of some sort. It's looking at basics of generic users. We will look at how profile options are set, how application security is developed at a very high level. Are you using standard responsibilities? Are those being assigned, or custom responsibilities using standard menus? We can gain a little bit of insight into how security is developed or roles are developed at a high level through that without going through a full SOD analysis. So we give you as an auditor or a security officer kind of a cursory understanding of how much confidence you can place in the processes that have been used internally. And if you have if the report comes back relatively clean, you can have a reasonable assurance that the process followed for role design and application security design was perhaps reasonable and thorough. If it comes back it's relatively weak, then you have more work to do. So that's like I said, it's the free service we offer. There's I think 10 SQL scripts we ask you to run, and we'll provide an analysis and a report at a high level to give you some generic feedback. Okay, so I think that about wraps it up today. Thank you both Jeff and Steve. Great presentation. And everybody be sure to put down your calendars, April 24th, our next webinar, Sensitive Administrative Pages in Oracle E-Business Suite. Are you overlooking this threat? So thank you again to everybody, and especially people that stayed with us. I know we're running a bit late here, but we appreciate your interest and the time you spend with us. Have a great day.